There are certain wounds that don't bleed, but ache quietly for years, tucked beneath shawls, hidden behind polite smiles at the general store. And some hearts, especially those that belong to women past their bloom, learn to live in silence until someone dares to see them. Eleanor Grace was 50, broad in the hips, soft in the arms, with laugh lines that told stories no one had cared to hear. Her hands were skilled good at mending shirts, kneading bread, and holding things together that wanted to fall apart. But in the eyes of the town, she was simply too much. Too big, too plain, too old to be anyone's first choice. She came west on a train, clutching a mail-order letter from a man who wanted a wife. She thought maybe this was her second chance. She had trimmed her hair, pressed her best dress, and even practiced smiling in the reflection of the train window. But when she stepped off that platform, she was met not with a warm hand or a kind gaze, but with laughter. Not cruel in the open, but cruel in the kind that cuts quiet. The man who had written her never even came. He sent a boy with a message. He changed his mind, said he didn't expect you to be like that. Like that. She stood there on the wooden platform, stomach-tight heart, heavier than her carpet bag. Her dress fluttered in the wind as families bustled past her. No one offered a word. What happens to a woman after she's told she takes up too much space in the world? Most fade, but not Eleanor, because farther down that platform a man was watching, not out of pity, not out of duty, but because something in her, some quiet dignity in the way she didn't crumble, reached something long buried in him. His name was Silas, a widowed rancher, a man folks called hard because he didn't speak much. But grief has a way of making men silent, and perhaps silence recognizes silence. He didn't ask for her hand. He didn't offer promises, but he did something rare. He walked beside her. And from that quiet gesture, something unexpected began to grow. Not out of passion, not out of loneliness, but out of respect. If you've ever been told you're too much, too loud, too big, too old, or if you've loved someone the world overlooked, then maybe this story is for you, because sometimes the gentlest kind of love begins in the most forgotten corners. So settle in, dear friend. Let's begin the story of Eleanor Grace, a woman rejected as a joke, who became the heart of a quiet man's world. They said she was too much, too large, too old, too slow with her hands, and too soft with her voice. The letters stopped coming after they saw her face. One man wrote back simply, "I was expecting someone younger." Another returned her photo with a Bible verse scribbled beside it, not one of love, but of discipline. At 50, Eleanor Grace had grown accustomed to the sound of rejection. But that didn't mean it stopped hurting. She lived above a seamstress shop, now in a borrowed room with creaking floorboards and a window that overlooked a dry, windswept street in Larkspur, Wyoming. The townsfolk greeted her kindly enough, but never asked her to stay long. Children sometimes giggled at her full figure when she passed. Adults averted their gaze. She sewed all day and prayed all night, not for a husband anymore, but for peace. But peace was not what life had in mind. When a letter arrived bearing the scrawled name of a rancher who'd seen her photo and didn't mind her age, Eleanor folded it carefully. I stared at it for 3 days, then pressed it to her heart. She didn't believe it yet, but something was stirring, something old and quietly hopeful. She thought she was too late for love, but destiny, it seemed, had other plans. The journey to Alder Creek was slow. Eleanor sat stiffly in the rattling stagecoach, her hands clutching the letter like scripture. The note had been short-written with a heavy hand and slightly crooked lines. "I read your posting. I saw your photograph. If you still wish to come, I have room. I'm not one for many words. My name's Elias. I live alone. I don't mind your age. I don't mind your weight. I just mind kindness." She read those last 3 sentences again and again. Still doubts clung to her like dust. By the time the coach stopped at the edge of Alder Creek, dusk had settled across the valley like a faded shawl. The town was smaller than she'd imagined, only a scattering of buildings pressed up against hills that caught the gold of the dying sun. A few children watched the coach with wide eyes. No one laughed this time. A man stood alone at the edge of the road, hat in hand. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just looked at her steadily, quietly. His beard was streaked with gray, and his shirt was worn but clean. His eyes were kind but tired, like a man who had buried more than one thing he loved. He didn't flinch when she stepped down. He didn't wince when the step creaked beneath her weight. He simply said, "You must be Miss Grace. I'm Elias. Welcome." No one had said her full name like that in years. No one had said welcome and meant it. The ride to his homestead was quiet, but not uncomfortable. He didn't fill the silence with empty chatter. And oddly enough, Eleanor didn't feel the need to. His land stretched wide fenced pasture, a weather-beaten barn, and a two-story farmhouse with peeling white paint and flower beds that had clearly once been cared for by someone who knew how. She noticed the way he touched the front gate before opening it, like it still held a memory. Inside the house smelled of pine soap and something warm, like old leather and cooked beans. There were no photographs, no frills, just wooden walls, a well-swept floor, and a fireplace that hadn't been lit in days. "I sleep downstairs," Elias said plainly. "You'd have the room up top, only one with a view." He didn't touch her, didn't leer, didn't rush. Instead, he let her be. That night, Eleanor sat on the bed and stared at the moon through a curtainless window. She could still feel the weight of years pressing against her, the words that had stung, the eyes that had dismissed. But tonight, no one had turned away. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like a burden. Eleanor thought silence meant rejection. But with Elias, silence might just mean safety. Eleanor had never known how deeply a silence could comfort her until she lived in Elias's home. The first few days passed like gentle wind over prairie grass, uneventful, but not empty. Mornings began with the scrape of Elias's boots against the wood floor and the scent of percolating coffee. He never asked her to cook. He never commented on how much she ate or didn't. Instead, he simply poured her a mug and nodded toward the sunrise through the kitchen window, as if saying, "You made it to another morning. That matters." There was work to be done always. Eleanor offered her hands even if they were clumsy, and while her joints ached from years of labor and her back protested every time she bent down, she didn't want to be idle. Elias didn't mock her when she fumbled with a chicken coop latch or spilled feed. He just stepped in without a word, helped her get it right, and moved on. No sighs, no judgment, just presence. Some days they rode into town together. Alder Creek had eyes as small towns often do. Eleanor felt them on her the way one feels flies, constant buzzing judgment. Whispers trailed behind her like dust. "She's bigger than I thought. She walks like she's sore. Why would Elias?" But Elias never flinched. He stood beside her at the mercantile like she was carved from the same sturdy wood as the porch posts on his ranch. When a man behind the counter gave a lingering glance at Eleanor's frame, Elias met his gaze not unkind but firm. "She's with me," he said plainly. "That's all you need to know." Those 4 words echoed louder than any love poem Eleanor had ever imagined. She didn't cry when she returned home that evening, but she sat on the porch swing alone, staring at the hills and let the quiet roll over her like a balm. She was beginning to learn that affection didn't have to shout. Sometimes it simply stood beside you, unshaken, unmoved. One evening, as Elias sat carving something by lamplight, Eleanor dared to ask, "Why did you write me back?" He paused, turning the small piece of pine wood in his hands. Then he looked up, eyes tired but sincere. "Because I knew what it was like to be seen only for what you've lost, not what you still carry." She didn't know what to say, so she didn't. And he didn't press her, but something in her softened. Just a little. The world called her too much. But with Elias, she was just enough, and maybe even more. Autumn came early that year in Alder Creek. The leaves curled brown at the edges and the wind whispered colder truths through the gaps in the walls. Eleanor had learned to move through Elias's home without apologizing for the floorboards that creaked beneath her weight or the occasional clumsy knock of a skillet on the stove. Still, the old voices echoed sometimes. "You eat like you're starving. You'll never be wanted. You're too much." She had heard those words from her late husband, Walter. He'd married her for land, used her for labor, and discarded her worth by degrees, always in private, always with a smile in public. By the time he passed, Eleanor didn't cry. Grief had nothing left to burn through. But grief had a cousin called shame, and that one stayed. It wasn't Elias who brought those old wounds back to the surface. It was a letter. Folded, plain, and unassuming, it came in the post from a cousin back east. "Just thought you ought to know," it said. "People still laugh about that ad. They say the man who rejected you told the saloon he wanted a woman, not a wagon. Eleanor read it alone. She didn't show Elias the letter. She simply folded it, placed it in the wood stove, and watched it burn. But ashes couldn't erase the old ache it stirred. That night at supper, her appetite shrank. Her shoulders drew inward again, like they used to when she was trying to become invisible. Elias noticed but didn't pry. Instead, he offered her something better than questions. "Want to ride with me to the edge fence tomorrow?" he asked. The rivers started shifting again. She nodded, grateful. The next morning, the sky was moody with low clouds and the horses smelled of wet grass. Eleanor climbed into the saddle slowly, careful, cautious. Elias waited patient. No hurrying, no offering to do it for her. Just presence. Respect. As they rode, Eleanor finally said aloud, "People think I'm a joke, that you must be lonely, desperate, or worse, that this was some sort of charity." Elias didn't turn right away. He gave the reins a thoughtful twitch and said softly, "I used to think silence meant safety, but sometimes silence lets lies grow roots." He stopped the horse and looked her in the eye. "I never wanted small," he said. "Not in words, not in women, not in life. You think your size is the thing people see. But I see the woman who didn't run even when the world laughed. That's strength. That's rare." Eleanor didn't weep, though her throat burned. Instead, she reached for his hand. It was rough, square, and warm. In the silence that followed, something shifted inside her. The shame wasn't hers. It never had been. When the world tried to weigh her down, Elias gave her space to rise, and this time, she didn't shrink to fit. The days grew shorter, and the frost came early to Alder Creek. The windows clouded with the breath of winter, but inside Elias's cabin, warmth lingered in the stew pot, in the silence that wasn't empty anymore. And in the way Eleanor began to take up space without apology. It began with bread. Eleanor baked one morning before sunrise, like she used to before Walter had mocked the sweet smell of sugar on someone too round to need it. This time her hands moved freely. No voice in her head scolded her for dusting the table too heavily or for humming while she kneaded. She even licked her finger once without shame. Elias came in from checking the livestock and said nothing about her floured face. He simply said, "Smells like a home." And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor believed that maybe it was. But change rarely comes without resistance. That evening, a knock at the door shattered their quiet. It was Jed Rourke, the man who had first posted the mail order ad that brought Eleanor west, and then laughed her off in front of his ranch hands. He hadn't come alone. Two others stood behind him, sneering. "Well, look at that," Jed grinned. "Thought you'd packed up and gone back east after I did you a kindness?" Elias stepped forward. Calm. Still. "I don't believe mockery's ever been a kindness," he said evenly. Jed scoffed. "You're just a widower gone soft. You think fat and plain is the best you can do now. She's a punchline, not a partner." Eleanor didn't shrink. Not this time. She stepped beside Elias, spine straight, voice steady. "I was never the punchline," she said. "You just weren't man enough to see the worth in me." Jed's smirk faltered, and something unspoken passed between her and Elias, a quiet knowing, a recognition that courage didn't always wear a gun belt. Sometimes it looked like a woman standing her ground in her own skin. After Jed left, Elias didn't say much, but he set a second place at the table with more care than usual. Later that night, Eleanor stood by the window watching the moonlight etch silver over the snow. She felt something she hadn't in years: freedom. Not the kind granted by others, but the kind you take back. When the man who once shamed her came knocking, Eleanor didn't flinch. She stood tall beside the man who saw her worth. Winter settled in thick and quiet, muffling the land in white and softening the world's edges. Eleanor moved about the cabin without tiptoeing. She sang while she chopped vegetables, her voice worn and low like the hum of a memory, long buried but finally safe enough to surface. Elias listened. He always did. One morning after the storm broke and the sky opened wide with sunlight, Eleanor stepped outside and found Elias repairing the fence. He was whistling off-key and slow, and didn't stop when he saw her watching. "You whistle worse than you talk," she teased. He tipped his hat without looking up. "That's a suppose I best keep talking then." She chuckled, but it wasn't just a joke. It was a new language between them, shared glances, soft laughter, and chores done side by side, not out of duty but companionship. Elias never once complimented her looks, but he brought her her shawl when the wind blew sharp. He carved a stool just her height for the kitchen. He didn't tell her she was beautiful. He treated her like she belonged. One night Eleanor lit a candle and asked the question that had lived quietly in the corner of her chest since she'd stepped off that train months ago. Why did you let me stay, Elias? Back then, when Jed laughed. Why didn't you laugh too? Elias didn't rush. He set down the book he'd been pretending to read. My Ruth, he said softly. She had the kind of beauty men wrote songs about. But even she didn't know what to do with silence or grief or long winters. You just moved into the quiet like it was home. Eleanor blinked. You saw something in me, she whispered. No, he said, shaking his head slowly. I saw you. And that was the beginning of something, not loud but lasting. That night she slept with the lamp still glowing beside her. Not because she feared the dark, but because, for the first time, she felt no need to hide from it. He didn't flatter her. He saw her, and that more than any love poem was the kindness that changed her life. The spring came slow that year, peeling away winter one thaw at a time. Eleanor stood barefoot on the porch, her apron dusted with flour, watching the sun melt snow into the thirsty earth. She was 51 now, her hair streaked with silver, her joints sometimes stiff in the morning. And still Elias looked at her like she was some long-lost letter he never thought he'd get to read again. They never married, not formally, not with papers or rings or crowds, but every nail hammered into that home, every meal shared at the scarred wood table, every quiet night sitting shoulder to shoulder as the fire crackled, that was their vow. That was enough. One evening a traveling preacher passed through town and asked Elias if he needed the good book read over his home. Elias declined, polite but firm. My home's already blessed, he said. I live with Eleanor. There were still townsfolk who whispered behind palms, about how she was too big for his narrow doorways, about how she was once the butt of a cruel joke. But neither Eleanor nor Elias answered them. They didn't need to, because they had built something most people only pretended to have, a life honest and quiet and full of small kindnesses. One morning a letter arrived addressed to Mrs. Monroe, though she'd never taken his name. Eleanor held it with both hands, not because it was heavy, but because it meant something. Someone somewhere now thought of her as belonging. She wept in the kitchen. Elias walked in, saw the tears, and without asking, picked up her hand, kissed the back of it, and began kneading dough beside her. There were no grand declarations, no parades, just a woman once discarded, now deeply quietly loved. And the ranch, though small and quiet, had never felt so much like a kingdom. They never asked the world to approve. They just kept showing up for each other. And in that, they found something deeper than acceptance, peace. Some love stories don't begin with fireworks or grand gestures. They begin in silence between two people the world forgot. Eleanor was once laughed at, dismissed as too fat and too old. But what others saw as a flaw, Silas saw as home. In the quiet rhythm of everyday life passing, the coffee tin fixing a fence together, sitting wordless beneath the dusk, Eleanor found something she'd never had, a place where she didn't need to shrink to be loved. Silas never asked her to be less. He simply stayed, and in his stillness, he made room for all of her. And maybe that's the lesson worth holding on to. You are never too much for the heart meant to hold you. If you've ever felt overlooked, passed by, or told you're too anything, let this story remind you dignity cannot be erased by rejection, and love, the kind that lasts, often comes slower but truer with time. Thank you for spending this time with us in the world of Wild West Saga. If Eleanor and Silas' story touched something in you, we invite you to subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Do you want to see more stories like this, of quiet love, second chances, and people who find their worth again? Let us know in the comments below. Your story matters too, and we'll be right here, ready to tell it. Wild West Saga.